In today's New Testament reading, Jesus recruits a tax collector to be one of his disciples. The man's name is Matthew. The Gospels of Mark and Luke tell the same story, except that in their accounts, the tax collector's name is Levi. There's no explanation as to why the names are different. Earlier in Matthew's Gospel, we find the account of Jesus recruiting his first disciples, Peter and Andrew, James and John, two pairs of brothers, all four of them fishermen. If it was surprising that Jesus would have chosen fishermen to be his disciples, it's downright shocking that he would choose a tax collector as well. And the story makes this clear. People aren't just shocked, they're offended. It's true, of course, that most people don't enjoy paying taxes. When I worked out my income tax return for last year, for example, I was dismayed to find out that I owed the government $1,000 more than I had anticipated. But in first century Israel, taxation was particularly onerous. And none of it went to programs like health care, education, employment insurance, public housing, or disability pensions, or things like that. Rather, it went to paying for public works, the military, and supporting the lavish lifestyles of the ruling class. And, as if that were not bad enough, Israel was not an independent country at that time. It was part of the Roman Empire, very much against its will. And that meant that some of their tax money went all the way to Rome, and that some of it was used to finance the Roman occupation of their country. In other words, average people in Israel, such as farmers and fishermen, got very little benefit from the taxes they paid. Well, if that sounds bad, it got even worse than that. Tax collectors were widely believed to be corrupt, charging the average person more than they were required to and pocketing the difference. And worse than that, if a farmer was unable to pay the full amount of tax owing, he would have to borrow the money, borrow the necessary funds from that same tax collector, at interest, of course. And if he was unable to repay the loan, the tax collector would foreclose on his land and then sell it to some or other wealthy landowner. It's no surprise then that resentment against tax collectors ran deep, especially toward those tax collectors who were themselves Israelites, preying on their own people, as you might say. So why in the world would Jesus recruit one of them to be one of his disciples? And why would he accept an invitation to dinner at Matthew's house to which other unsavory people had also been invited? This, in fact, is the question that the Pharisees asked Jesus' disciples. Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? Jesus answers the question himself. He begins with a short proverb or maxim. It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. Next, he quotes a verse from today's Old Testament reading. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. And he concludes by saying, I have come to call not the righteous, but sinners. Jesus' reply is revealing. Even if he doesn't explain why he chose Matthew in particular to be one of his disciples, it shows that he believed that a person who does wrong is not necessarily a bad person. It shows that he believed that it was possible for a person who does wrong to change his or her ways. It shows that he believed that even unsavory people like first century tax collectors could be reclaimed by God and learn to live in God's ways and thereby become the kind of people that God wanted them to be. It's telling that Jesus quoted these particular words from today's reading from Hosea. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. Actually, the quotation isn't quite exact. What it says in Hosea's original Hebrew is, and I don't know Hebrew, I'm just going by what they tell me in the commentaries, I desire steadfast love and not sacrifice. But the gospel writer was writing in Greek, and he used the Greek word for mercy to translate the Hebrew word for steadfast love. However, the sense of the quotation is the same, I think, regardless of the word. What Hosea was getting at was that God wasn't pleased that the people of Israel of his time were just going through the motions when it came to their relationship with him. God wanted more from them than just their sacrifices and offerings. He wanted them to live in his ways, to let their lives be shaped by his values and principles. That is, God wanted them to be fair, compassionate, and kind to each other, and not just to go through the motions of offering the required sacrifices, believing that he would be satisfied with just that. Jesus was dealing with a similar situation in his ministry, and particular in today's Gospel, New Testament reading. His critics, the Pharisees, were a sect within Judaism who believed in strict adherence to the Old Testament law. They believed that God required the people of Israel to obey all the commandments of the law meticulously and rigidly. They were not bad people, they were good people. But there was one problem with their attitude. They looked down on everyone who didn't measure up to their standards. They wrote those people off as sinners and considered them to be worthless. That wasn't Jesus' attitude at all. His attitude was that even so-called sinners had value in God's eyes, and that they shouldn't be written off. He believed that they deserved to be loved and treated with mercy, and that each one could potentially be reclaimed and persuaded to change their ways. As he himself put it, I have come to call not the righteous, but sinners. To Jesus, rigid, mindless obedience to the Old Testament law missed the point, just as the people of Hosea's day missed the point by focusing only on offering the required sacrifices to God. The key word in this passage is the word mercy. According to the dictionary, mercy means kind or compassionate treatment of an offender or adversary in one's power. Or compassion, where severity is expected or deserved. So Jesus showed mercy to Matthew by recruiting him to be one of his disciples, rather than condemning him for taking advantage of people, which is what the Pharisees would have expected him to do. Mercy is motivated by compassion, and compassion is what Jesus showed toward people throughout his ministry, including the people in the other two stories in today's reading, the woman with the chronic bleeding, whom he heals, and the dead girl whom he brings back to life. Jesus had a compassionate attitude toward people, not just to those with diseases or disabilities, but also those who did wrong and took advantage of others. In today's story, then, Matthew is faced with a choice, either to go with Jesus or to stay in his tax booth. He chooses to go with Jesus. So what happened to him? Unfortunately, like most of the others in Jesus' group of 12 disciples, the New Testament tells us almost nothing about him. There are 4 lists of the 12 disciples in the New Testament, in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and the book of Acts, and Matthew's name is included in each one of them. But aside from today's story and those 4 lists, he's mentioned nowhere else in the New Testament, not even in the Gospel of John. Did Matthew do the same thing that another tax collector, Zacchaeus, does in the Gospel of Luke? As you may remember, Zacchaeus promised to repay all the money that he had defrauded people of. If Matthew did the same, today's reading doesn't say so. Was Matthew the same person as the Matthew who wrote Matthew's Gospel? Christians have always assumed so, but we don't know that for sure. All that we can confidently surmise about Matthew is that he gave up tax collecting, that along with the rest of the 12 disciples, he then followed Jesus around for the remainder of his ministry, and that after Jesus' ascension and after Pentecost, he became one of the leaders of the community of Jesus' followers. In other words, his life changed when Jesus recruited him, and changed in a positive direction. So we can say Jesus' mercy toward him paid off in the long run. So what can we learn from this story? The point of this story lies in the contrast between the attitude of the Pharisees toward people like Matthew and the attitude of Jesus. The Pharisees were judgmental and condemning. Jesus, on the other hand, was merciful and accepting. Jesus wasn't as interested in who and what Matthew had been as in who and what Matthew might become. If we're someone like Matthew, someone who has hurt others or taken advantage of others, this story contains good news. It tells us that God doesn't necessarily write us off. God still loves us, and rather than condemning us, he challenges us to change our attitudes and actions for the better. In biblical terminology, the word for this is to repent. Repent, of course, is often an emotionally charged word, but it doesn't need to be. It simply means to realize that we're going the wrong way and to make a decision to change the way we think and the way we act. The story of Jesus recruiting Matthew shows us that God doesn't consider us to be worthless. Rather, he values us. He isn't interested only in what we've done in the past. He's much more interested in what we do in the present and the future. And if, on the other hand, we're someone like the Pharisees, today's story contains a challenge. It challenges us to think about our own attitudes to people we know or know of who get themselves into trouble or cause trouble for others. It's natural, even instinctive, for us to make negative judgments about people like that. Like the Pharisees, we can be quick to write such people off and to consider them to be no good, worthless. However, today's story reminds us that God doesn't see only the bad in a person, he sees also the good and the potential. And the story challenges us to do the same. When we were kids, perhaps there was some other kid in our neighborhood whom our parents told us to stay away from because they'd be a bad influence on us. Perhaps those of you who are parents have also said the same thing to your own kids. As adults, too, it's true that some people can be a bad influence on us, but it is also true that we can be a good influence on others, just as Jesus and his other disciples were on Matthew. Let's then not be too quick to pass judgment on others or too harsh in the judgments we make. In this regard, I take issue with those so-called law and order politicians who advocate harsh measures against people who break the law. Longer sentences, more prisons, and the like. Surely there's a better way to deal with crime than just to lock more and more people up for longer and longer periods of time. It's not a very compassionate or merciful response. Indeed, in my opinion, it's an easy, quick fix, short-sighted solution that doesn't yield the desired results in the long run. That being said, I realize that there are those who can't be influenced or persuaded to change their ways for one reason or another, and who do need to be dealt with firmly and decisively, people in our own circles, as well as in society at large. However, today's story about Matthew challenges us not to be too hasty or too harsh in making our judgments. I desire mercy, said Jesus. Let us be glad that God is inclined to be merciful to us when we do things that are wrong or hurtful. And let us likewise show mercy to those who wrong us. Praise and glory. Thank